going live, and I'm live. Hello, I'm Anavultus, and welcome to the Anavultus Show. And today, I will be speaking about current events. I've actually had an idea to talk about these current events for some time now, but I think waiting has only enriched my knowledge, and for this reason, I am choosing to speak of them now. Now, before I really get into things, let me just make sure everything is set up. So I need to make sure everybody's getting the link so that people know I'm actually streaming. So let's quickly. The way I do this, okay, this is some insider info. The way I do this is I go to my YouTube channel and then I click on the live stream there, and then I use the URL from there to post other places. Uh, because I guess I'm a bit of a random guy here, so that's how it works. So if I do save link as, then I don't actually have to click on it. Oh wait, no. Let me just copy link address. That's what I need to do. There you go. So let me just show everyone that I'm live. So if people will bear with me on this. So, bam. And I'll start talking a little bit here. So anyway, one of the recent issues, the death of George Floyd, that's a huge issue that apparently people are talking about now quite a lot, to the point that there's a lot of protests about it. Now, I personally, let me be very honest here, I've never been in favor of protests. I don't think that they really accomplish things, at least not in the way that I would like to accomplish things. In other words, there's a difference, in my view, between protesting and getting things done. And I don't think that protests are very persuasive. And if anybody has seen protests and been involved in protests, then people should know that frequently what can happen is people can actually hijack protests quite easily, which is a lot different from, let's say, either voting or debating or speaking with your words, which is very different than marching and sloganing. So, in my view, I generally see protests as an inferior form of political discourse that I personally would not engage in, not because I have, let's say, an idea of being necessarily above that in a way, but rather because I don't think that it accomplishes things in the way that I would like to accomplish them. In other words, it doesn't generate the type of political discourse that I like to engage with, and therefore I do not encourage it because of that reason. Now, that being said, going back to George Floyd, I saw the video, and in the video of the death of George Floyd, it's actually very hard to tell exactly, okay, and I mean exactly, because I'm a martial artist, so this applies very much from experience. It's a bit difficult to tell exactly how much force the police officer is applying to George Floyd. Now, the reason why I say that is because the actual criminal event here, the event that is actionable from the perspective of the law, is not, of course, the fact that George Floyd was being detained or the fact that he was being pinned to the ground, because policemen do that on a regular basis, and it is not something that policemen generally are criticized over, at least not in any usual serious way. Now, I understand that there are questions of excessive force, but detaining someone in itself is different from excessive force, because it is legal for the police to detain someone, especially someone who presumably, as George Floyd had been, was caught red-handed committing a crime. Now, it's not a violent crime that George Floyd committed, but it nevertheless was a crime that the police at the time believed necessitated an an arrest, and therefore they tried to arrest him, and they were unable to get him into the vehicle. And it is after that that then you see him on the floor, that they've got him on the floor. Now, then the question, therefore, is, and I'm talking about the other police officers that are now considered to be implicated in this event as participating in aiding and abetting murder, and also are accused of perhaps manslaughter. Now, the charges are a bit in flux at the moment as more information is coming out, as there are conflicting reports from different coroners. So, what happens from the other officer's perspective, in my opinion, because the officer that was detaining George Floyd, in his detention of George Floyd, that detention was legal. Therefore, the real question is, in the excessive application of force leading to injury and death, from that perspective, I don't think that it is reasonable to hold the other police officers accountable for what that one officer did, because, at least from the angle that I saw, it's actually quite difficult to understand exactly how much force was being applied. And I'm saying that as someone that has experience with applying force. Okay. So, in that sense, I'm saying that the other officers, I think it's excessive to say that they were aiding and abetting a murder, because uh, because I don't think that it is reasonable to say that they knew that a murder was going on. Now, for them to know that a murder was going on, either the application of force needed to be so excessive that the officers would have been clearly aware of it, which, from the evidence that I have seen, is I mean, there's probably different angles that the officers were at in relation to George Floyd, other than camera angle that we see. But obviously, we have to go on the evidence that we have. We can't go on evidence that we don't have, because that would be in violation of jurisprudential principles. So, what I'm saying here is, the real question is, were the other officers aware that excessive force was being applied? Now, people might say, well, George Floyd was saying that he couldn't breathe, and he was obviously calling for help in some way. Now, the problem here is that George Floyd was being arrested and detained for a an alleged criminal act. Now, I'm going to put a an let's say a presumption of innocence upon George Floyd, even though most people at this point would say that it's pretty obvious that he did something. I'm going to put a presumption of innocence and say that the police officers had reasonable concern to believe that he had committed a crime, and that is why they were detaining him, which is different than saying that he is guilty, which is also different from how the media immediately calls the event a murder before a conviction has occurred. Now, if nobody ends up getting convicted for murder, then what happens is, and I think this is very important, then it would mean that the media would be falsely reporting by referring to a killing or to the death of an individual as a murder when it's not actually a murder. Now, of course, the language on third-degree murder in Minnesota is very, I'll say, flexible, which means it's actually, in my view, a bad formulation of a law when it talks about evincing a depraved mind. What is that supposed to mean? How do you prove that? It's in a way, What I'm saying is that the way in which the law is written, the wording of the law, makes it relatively easy for someone to bend the wording to prove anything they want. And those are the exact kinds of laws that I think people shouldn't have. I think laws should be based on proving objective things. So the other way in which the officers could be said to have been aiding and abetting the killing, assuming that they were unaware of the excessive force, or that the officers would not admit to seeing that the force was excessive. The other way in which you could say there's a path for them to aiding and abetting would be if the murder had been premeditated, therefore a first degree murder, in which case it could have been a conspiracy. Now, the problem here with saying that it is premeditated is that that would imply that the officers at some point had an agreement to kill this man, which would mean you'd have to prove that, which I think is likely unlikely to prove, likely unlikely. There, so no real point to say likely. I can just say unlikely. Uh, and of course, no evidence so far shows that that is the case. Now, on the question of whether there was intent to kill George Floyd, I think that's another question that I think is worthwhile, because another important question is, at what point does the actions of a police officer become criminal? Because arresting is not criminal, detaining is not criminal, pinning him on the floor as part of detaining him is also not criminal. So the question then is, it goes to excessive application of force. Now, in a court of law, people could point to the conflicting coroner's reports, because what's happened is a coroner report came out that said that it is unlikely that him being pinned led to his death, and that it more likely had to do with circulatory issues that George Floyd already had. In other words, it could have been very possible that he would have died anyway, even if he had not been arrested at that very day. Or the other report says that it is actually has to do with the force being applied to his body. So I saw what the media did. The media immediately discarded the first account and then went for the second account there, and pretended like the first one didn't exist. Now the problem is that's not how science works. Okay? There's two observations, and what we have to do is now we have to look at the methodology. Now we have to look at the interpretation of what is found, because we're both sides are working with the same body here. And so obviously George Floyd died. We need to figure out how exactly he died. So now we need to compare the two reports, and we need to come to a thesis, antithesis, synthesis to understand why did one report assume that circulatory issues played a greater part, pre-existing conditions played a greater part in the death of George Floyd, and why did the other one put such a large emphasis on the force that the officer was applying, and why is it that the two reports seem to be conflicting? Now, in the defense of the officer in the court, that is something that will certainly come up if they hire a good lawyer. The lawyer can easily argue, the advocate, the lawyer, the defense attorney can easily argue that from the difference between the reports, it's not actually clear how George Floyd died. And if it's not clear how George Floyd died, then it's not clear whether he was killed. And if it's not clear whether he was killed, then it's not clear whether the defender is actually guilty. Now, the problem is the U.S. legal system doesn't actually work on facts. It works on opinions. So what you have to do is you have to persuade the jury. So obviously, it's going to be harder and harder to get a jury to work on this case because of how much the death has blown up in the news. If this had been an issue that was restrained to Minneapolis, then it probably wouldn't have been as bad. But the problem is that this is not an issue that has been restrained to Minneapolis. Now, this is a national issue. Now, the media is already painting that policeman as a murderer before he has even been convicted and before the final charges have actually been, he has even pleaded anything. Now the media is referring to it as a murder when there are questions asking, the serious questions as to whether this could be a manslaughter. And if this is a manslaughter, then that means that the media has been giving fake news. So what should the media be doing? What the media should be doing is they should be saying that George Floyd died, that the policeman is under high suspicion of having killed him, and that the charges being brought against him are murder and manslaughter. And of course, referring to the degrees, which seem to change by the day, depending on whose evidence people are looking at. So this is, of course, a much bigger issue than, because now people have gone out into the streets. Now there are serious protests, serious riots, and serious rebellion. Now, I will point out that rebellion is, or insurrection, as the law has it, is actually very criminal. And I think that's important to notice. Because the problem, however, that I think the law has on this issue is that the law is actually insufficient. The law is insufficiently harsh on rebels, and I think Donald Trump himself has gone very soft on this issue. People say Trump is being too harsh. I say he's not being harsh enough. Okay, so now let me be very clear here. I'm not arguing for people to go out and shoot people. I'm not arguing in favor of that. What I am arguing for is, obviously, if your life or your property are in danger, then I think it's justifiable defense in accordance with the laws of whatever jurisdiction you're in. On the other hand, I'm arguing for state action. Okay, so I'm not arguing for any murder, because state action, by definition, by its very nature, cannot be murder, unless there is a higher authority that defines it as murder. So, in other words, because we have laws, the laws define what our crimes are, which means to say that the government is murdering someone can be silly if, according to the law of a government, it is illegitimate killing. For example, killing people in war, killing enemy combatants in war is not a murder, or capital punishment is not a murder. Now, there are people that are very strongly against capital punishment, and I understand that they're very strongly against capital punishment, but I think that capital punishment and the use of lethal force is essential for the survival of a state. In other words, when people like Gandhi come up and they lead a massive breaking of the law needs to stop them, or the law will be destroyed. And that is the success of Gandhi. The success of Gandhi is that the law was not strong enough to stop Gandhi. The enforcers of the law were unwilling to stop Gandhi, and therefore their authority over India was strongly eroded. And that is the success of Gandhi, but also the insidiousness of Gandhi. So I think it's a similar problem in countries that are unwilling to enforce their laws, countries that are unwilling to defend themselves against existential threats, even when those existential threats come from within. And the example I would put is rebellion. Okay? I think the appropriate response for rebellion is the death penalty. Now, unfortunately, the government, the US government, disagrees. I think I might be slightly off on this. It's either 15 or 25 years maximum for insurrection, prison. And I don't think prison time is particularly useful anyway, because I think the most effective way, in my view, to deal with crime is to fix the problem that the crime caused. So, for example, in theft, the problem that you're fixing in theft is damages. In vandalism, the problem that you're fixing is quantifiable damages. If someone is injured, there's quantifiable damages. And therefore, there should be remuneration from the perpetrator. In other words, if somebody steals, let's say, an estimate $1,000 from you, that person should be required by law to not only give you $1,000, but to give you a bit on top of that for the inconvenience of you having lost $1,000. Because people can say, well, the human lives can't be replaced, but people's property can be replaced. That's what people say. Well, actually, I'll say that there are some things that those people lose by the destruction of their property that cannot be replaced, such as opportunities. Opportunities that led to the construction of a property may not be present again for the reconstruction of a property. Opportunities that the possession of a property affords someone may not be recovered during the loss of that property. Also, the time invested in that property will never be recovered, because time is limited for human beings. We don't have an infinite amount of time to build financial empires. Someday we die. And if we die, then that means that whatever we've built is whatever we leave behind. And in the case of some people, they will leave behind a lot less if they have people disrupt their property and destroy their property. Now, I'm not saying that people should leave behind a large amount of stuff, okay? That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that there is a quantifiable loss, a quantifiable permanent loss to any vandalism. So, for this reason, I think there should be remuneration And this is not an original idea. This is an ancient idea. You can even see this in the Bible, where in the Torah, the law of Moses, if someone steals your sheep and then sells them to someone else, then you have to give more sheep in return in order to make up for what you've stolen. In other words, you give back the exact amount of damages multiplied for the opportunity loss and the loss of time. And I think that that's a very effective way to maintain order in a society. And it also means that people who engage in criminal activities then launder the money, if they get caught, end up still having a net loss, which is very important for the discouraging of criminal activity. Now, for this reason, I don't think that long-term incarceration is very useful, because long-term incarceration does not actually afford very many economic benefits. There's much more economically efficient ways to cause restitution for damages than concentrating people in a penitentiary facility. Now, you might say, well, if you don't do that, if you don't imprison them, what if they escape and they just escape their responsibilities? Well, what you do then is you go down a lot harsher on them, okay? What you do is then you put the death penalty. So in other words, you can either obey the rules, okay? You may break the rules occasionally in some small ways, but we can fix that. You just have to pay back a few times over what damages you've caused. But if you then reject the system of justice itself, the system of justice which affords justice to the citizens of the country, which ensures the protection of the people of the country by means of the mechanisms of the state, if you rebel against that, then you have done a harm not only against the state, but also harm against the system of justice, and also harm against all the people that benefit from the system of justice by debasing that justice. So, in that sense, I think that the harm that rebellion does is unquantifiable, because it has such a large ripple effect. Now, you can say that even stealing a single item from a convenience store has a large ripple effect. There's a butterfly effect that pulls out. But when you actually go against the government and you rebel against the government, you start burning the cop cars, you burn down the police precincts, you call for the death of police officers, and you start talking about revolution. When you start doing those things, you are harming the very system of justice that everybody else is relying upon. And therefore, in my view, you become an existential threat to justice, as well as an existential threat to the state. Now, when you become an existential threat to the state, I think it's only fair that the state becomes an existential threat to you. In other words, I think that capital punishment for rebellion is the ideal punishment. In my view, capital punishment for rebellion is something that is necessary from a realistic perspective of the state. Now, I think Machiavelli would agree on this one. And it also is necessary for the respect that people have for justice. Because justice, Machiavelli says, it's better to be feared than to be loved. And he's not necessarily wrong to that. I say it is better to be loved than to be feared, but it is better to be feared than to have nothing at all. So in my view, I think if a country is good and respectable, there's a lot of people that will love that country. Now, you have to realize that people have different paradigms, different worldviews, so people will not necessarily love the country. There are many people that will love different countries. There are many people that want the country to be in a different way. So relying on people to be patriotic in order to uphold the law doesn't really work. In other words, you can't just make a bunch of laws and then everybody agrees and everybody follows them. Evil exists, okay? People are not going to follow all the laws. So what you have to do then is you have to create a system that enforces the laws. So you've got three kinds of motivations for obedience. You've got a simple governmentality, where people simply accept the law for no serious reason and are irrationally following the law. Then you have people that love the law, which you could say is also irrational, but I think is a different form of justification and is very admirable. And then on the third hand, you have fear. And fear is better than hatred. Okay, if people hate the law, then people will want to overthrow it. But if people fear the law, then they have a rational reason to obey it. Because what is fear? Fear is not only an emotional quality. Fear is useful because fear tells you that there is a serious danger somewhere. So if there is a danger, then fear is the emotion for the avoidance of danger. Now, I understand that there are some people that are fearful over unreasonable things, but I think it's fair to reason that in a properly established state which holds the monopoly of violence, that fear from the state is justified. Rationally, that is. Because if you break a law, and there's a serious possibility that you're going to be punished for breaking a law, then doesn't that put one more reason not to break the law in your reasoning? In your rationale, in your cost-benefit analysis of should I break the law, the cost of breaking a law is, one of them is retaliation by the government. And if the government makes laws but never retaliates for people breaking the laws, then what is the point? Because if people aren't going to be afraid of the institution that produces the law and that enforces the law, then what happens is that people will ignore the law. And this is what my book, for some weird reason, I actually found a way to spin this back around my book. This suddenly came into my mind. My book, Actionable Justice, is about. My book, Actionable Justice, says that justice is not only the principles, but is also the implementation of the principles. There exists a set of laws, you could say, made by authorities, but those authorities need to place those laws upon a jurisdiction. In this case, the authorities would be the federal government and the state governments and the local governments. There's a hierarchy of authorities. Okay, I acknowledge that in my book. There's a hierarchy of authorities. And of course, people say that the country is under God. Not all people agree on that, but if you do agree on that, there's another level to the hierarchy there. But anyway, there's a hierarchy of authorities, and each authority has its jurisdiction. And in order to enforce the law in that jurisdiction, you need a method to enforce it, the method of enforcement. Now, once you have that method of enforcement, when someone breaks the law, then you can enact punishment. So you have the law, you have the jurisdiction, you have the enforcement, and you've got the punishment. And once you have all those four, then you can say that you have justice. If any one of those is missing, well, you can't really get the last one without the second to last one, because that doesn't logically function. But if you're missing something here, then you don't have justice. See what I'm saying? If you are acting at complete random, and you're not actually trying to get anybody to obey any form of behavior, then you're not acting in a just way. If you are acting on your own without any jurisdiction to place this upon, then you might have something in theory, but you don't actually have any effect. In other words, I can make up any ethics I want, any ethical system I want, but if I don't actually enforce it on anyone, then nobody can say that my system of ethics is good. And then if you don't have a means in which to place that system of ethics that you now have in a jurisdiction, if you don't have a means to actually control that jurisdiction, then it will fall apart. And then if you have the means, but you're not willing to use the means, then it also falls apart, which is what we're seeing, what we're seeing right now. These countries, stuff is being destroyed. The governors, the mayors aren't being tough enough on these guys to get them to stop. Because if real bullets started flying, if people started setting up machine guns and shooting down the rioters, you better believe those riots are going to stop. Okay? The governors should have been active at least, at the very earliest, that is, on day 2. Okay? Because day 1, you could say it's the mayor's job. And if a mayor doesn't do anything, or if the mayor's job falls apart, or if the mayor starts giving ground to the destruction, then the mayor has failed. Therefore, it becomes the governor's job. Now, if a governor doesn't start the crackdown and instead also gives ground, then it's the president's job. And if the president doesn't start the crackdown and also gives ground, then we've got nothing left. Then you could say it's in the hands of God. Jesus, take the wheel. You can say that, but it shows a failure of the government to enforce its authority in its jurisdiction. And I'm saying that Donald Trump, which some people have said has been too harsh, has not been harsh. Because it should have been a 3-day affair. Day 1, the mayors need to show that they have the strength and the initiative to take care of the issue. And I'm not talking about the peaceful protesters, okay? They're allowed to do that. They're allowed to peacefully protest. But when people start getting violent, when they destroy a police precinct and they start burning cop cars, that's when you know something has gone wrong. When the police precinct is abandoned and evacuated instead of being fortified, instead of them breaking out all the guns, okay, getting the big guns out, because this is the US, there are SWAT teams, so we know we've got the big guns. The police has big guns. And if they don't have big guns in the precinct, they should have gotten some support. But instead what the mayor does and what the police does is they retreat. Instead of standing their ground and actually showing that they have the authority. And I think that's a huge disgrace, okay? A huge disgrace on the mayors, a huge disgrace on whatever county seats there are, a huge disgrace on the governors, and a huge disgrace on the president, okay? Now, it's not too late, okay? It's never too late. We can say the past is a mistake, but the future will get it right. We can say that. But the time to do that is now. Every day that this goes on and no lethal force is used by the police or by the National Guard or by the military, every day that the rioters and the rebels are allowed to go around and destroy things, is a day that is not only culpable upon the exact perpetrators of the damages, but also upon the negligence that the leaders of those jurisdictions have displayed. And I think that Donald Trump has been negligent. Now, I don't say that this negligence is criminal. I can say that this is a strategic mistake. We'll call it a strategic mistake, a mistake in grand strategy, even, because putting down rebellions is very important for the integrity of the state. Now, on other issues, Hong Kong. Okay, let's talk about China. Because people say, well, Anavultus, if you're okay with them using lethal force against the protesters, you must be okay with the Tiananmen Square protest massacre. And you know what? I am okay with that. Yes. Okay? Give it a Chad yes on that. Why? Because I do not tolerate rebels. Okay? I'm not a socialist. Okay? I'm not a national socialist. I'm not a communist. I'm not some authoritarian individual, some totalitarian individual. I'm not arguing that people shouldn't have liberties. Okay? What I am arguing for is that people in government should act realistically rather than idealistically. What I'm saying is, if there's something that is destabilizing your country, you need to deal with it. That's a very simple fact of realist politics anyway. I know that there's many idealists out there. I think idealism has become popular. People like, let's say, Woodrow Wilson, massive chaos that can be partially attributed to Woodrow Wilson, but it just shows what happens when you get your priorities wrong. But on the question of, was it justified for the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army to kill individuals that were illegally protesting in the Chinese capital? The answer is yes, it is justified. Now, obviously, I would argue that there should be an escalation where first the police comes in, asks people to leave because they're illegally protesting. Then if they don't leave, and if there's too many for the police to deal with, then you get the military in. Then they are asked to leave or to be placed under arrest. And if they also refuse, that's when you use lethal force. Okay? No, don't talk to me about people doing civil disobedience non-violently. Okay? A crime is a crime. I'll say that again. A crime is a crime. Civil disobedience is criminal, and therefore it should not be tolerated by individuals that are interested in creating a country that actually enforces its own laws. Now, that being said, I'm very much in favor of legal reform. I think that there's a lot of things about the United States and about other countries that should be reformed. So I'm not arguing against the anti-establishment sentiments that people have. What I am arguing against is the types of attitudes that lead to widespread destruction. Because people that are in favor of, let's say, the Boogaloo, okay, you go back in time and you look at previous Boogaloos in history. Widespread rebellion, the collapse of government authority. And what do you see? What you see is the French Revolution, massive chaos. Now, it was salvaged a little bit by the fact that the military, elements of the military, decided to side with the rebels, which massively reduced uh, the potential casualties, but at the same time, you could say that the power vacuum and the chaotic governance that followed and the lack of experience of a lot of the leaders involved led to widespread suffering and an enormous number of deaths, both in France and in the rest of Europe, as well as other parts of the world that were involved in the wars of the coalition and the Napoleonic Wars. Uh, so, in that sense, it is important to note that I say is an example of when the Boogaloo does a lot more harm than it does good. Another example I would say is Russia. After Russia lost World War One, or at least their part of World War One, they ended up going into a revolution where a lot of the military sided with the rebels, leading to the swift overthrow of the Russian monarchy. Then they had a huge election, and the Socialist Revolutionary Party got a plurality in the legislature, but the Bolsheviks weren't very happy with that. So then everybody had a huge civil war. And unfortunately for them, the agrarian socialists lost, and the Marxists came in charge, and then a lot more people died. But anyway, there's a lot of deaths involved there, as opposed to a much slower form of gradual change. Now, another example, the crisis of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire. Various parts of the empire were unsatisfied with leadership, and various individuals were proclaimed emperors by their own military followers. And of course, there were also invasions at the same time as all this was happening. So there's a multiple way civil war that keeps breaking out every time it stops. And so it's repeated civil wars, and then there's huge plagues, and then there's people invading the country. And of course, the Roman Empire survived, but it came out a lot weaker than it started out. So I would say is another example of a somewhat of a boogaloo. Now, Germany, at the end of World War One, the monarchies in Germany collapsed, and the socialists took over. But then the socialists realized that if they went too socialist, then the military wouldn't support them. And if the military didn't support them, they'd get a huge civil war. So what happened then is they decided to go moderate. So you've got Friedrich Ebert, the first president of Germany at that time. Well, he was the chancellor first, but before that, he was the leader of some workers' council or something, because Germany, the Weimar Republic, started out as a socialist state that then became more moderate, and then became National Socialist. So it's a lot of history and political stuff that I had researched there. But anyway, the U.S. is different because the U.S. didn't have a boogaloo in the revolution. What happened is previously existing government entities, the states or colonies at the time, decided to rebel as pre-existing political units with experienced leaders at their head that also had their own armed forces and police. So in that sense, it's not a boogaloo, and therefore did not fail as hard as other revolutions that were based on the people rebelling. China has had probably a dozen different boogaloos, and they've all been horrible and some of the deadliest wars in human history. So, what I'm saying here is that the boogaloo kills a lot of people. So, I'm not in favor of a boogaloo because it destroys the resources that a country has and makes the country a lot weaker to foreign invasion. People that are in favor of the US government being overthrown not only have to worry about what's happening in the US, okay, even though that is important, they also have to think about what about the rest of the world? Because the US is, whether you like it or not, is very important geopolitically. So when the US government gets overthrown, what happens to the rest of the world? There's a lot of countries that rely on the US for their defense. Now, you might say that this is something that shouldn't be that way, but you also have to realize that this is not an unconditional support, that by being defended by the US actually exerts a hegemonic power over them. So, in that way, there's many countries in the world that you could say, from some perspectives, could be considered part of the US, or at least the US sphere of influence. For example, Ukraine, after the revolution there, that of course the US and Russia both decided to take advantage of, or the fact that the US has been trying to overthrow various countries as part of foreign policy from the Arab Spring. So you see Operation Timber Sycamore, and Syria went into a boogaloo. so that brings me back to the boogaloo issue, and all these different rebel groups. And believe it or not, a lot of these rebel groups are actually not very respectable, and it is very shameful that the U.S. would support the destabilization of Syria, leading to many thousands of deaths, not just in Syria, but in other countries that the U.S. has intentionally destabilized, and many displaced people, as well as the deterioration of the European Union, also being contributed for by the U.S. in the U.S.'s support for various groups. Now, on the issue of terrorism, the U.S. has a very interesting definition of terrorism that essentially says that the U.S. can define, and I've read the book of codes, the U.S. code, okay, on terrorism as a crime. The U.S. government gets to define who it considers to be a terrorist, and anyone that the U.S. considers to be a terrorist will not be considered to be a military force. In other words, the U.S. can essentially ignore the rules of war that the U.S. has agreed upon by treaty anytime it wants. It's a huge loophole that the U.S. is using a lot. For example, the killing of Soleimani. People say, well, he was a terrorist. Well, I say the U.S. called him a terrorist so that they could kill him, because otherwise it would have been a violation of the rules of war. The U.S. gives itself a loophole on that, and the U.S. can give itself a loophole on that because the U.S. is the most powerful country in the world, and also the UN headquarters is located in the U.S., so the U.S. gets to decide what happens there. So, in other words, what I'm saying here is that the U.S. is using a lot of its influence. And I'm not saying that the U.S. should be acting in this way. I think the U.S. should be acting in a very honorable way, declaring war on people, taking land from enemies you've declared war on. I think that's something that the U.S. should be doing, that it isn't doing. And I think not gaining an imperialistic leverage in its foreign policy is in the long term going to damage the U.S. In relation to other countries that are willing to do that, such as Russia when they took Crimea. So in that way, I think a country needs to be very concerned about geopolitics, especially with the rise of China. China's military is growing. China is working a lot on innovation. China is building up its economy. China has a bigger population than the US, so there's a lot more man hours that China can rely upon, and increased education and development in China, while ruining China's ability to make cheaper goods than the US by uh, by increasing the standard of living in China. It however allows China to focus on different things, and now China can outsource the production of cheap goods to other countries, and then still economically gain a profit from that due to various Chinese foreign policy maneuvers that the US has not been very effective in countering. For example, the US puts tariffs on China. Trump thinks tariffs are going to work against China, but China can simply circumvent the tariffs by sending the goods to another country, having them slightly modified, and then sending them to the US, and still make the lion's share of the profit, while at the same time building trade relations with the other country and increasing China's power there. Now, China at the current time doesn't really have any reliable allies, because Russia is somewhat opposed to China foreign policy wise, and the US is somewhat opposed to China foreign policy wise, and all the other countries that are friendly to China are too small to deal with either Russia or the US. So those countries, if China gets invaded, aren't going to help China, because then from a realistic perspective, it could mean the end of those countries. So in other words, alliances where there's one big country and several smaller countries generally don't hold up when there's another big country attacking, because the several smaller countries can simply choose to switch their allegiance to to the other country attacking, or to remain neutral and not lose anything, as opposed to going to war and losing possibly everything. So China is currently in a position where China doesn't actually have any reliable allies for a major war against the US or Russia. Now, this means that China needs to build up other countries that are not already in large alliance blocks that the US and Russia have, such as what you could call the Western countries. You've got US, NATO, the UK's in there, France is in there. They're grouped together. Russia has Belarus, which is essentially an extension of Russia. Uh, Russia has Iran. Russia has Syria. Russia is working on getting Turkey to switch sides. Russia is working on getting Germany to switch sides. So Russia has some allies that are pretty useful. Meanwhile, what does China have? China has maybe North Korea, but North Korea isn't going to defend China. They don't want to lose their sovereignty. Then you've also got Vietnam, maybe, but what does Vietnam have to gain by defending China? Vietnam isn't very strong of a country, even though it's, at least compared to other big hitters out there, Vietnam is not an extremely powerful country. So, meanwhile, the US has South Korea and Japan, both of whom are well-developed countries with reasonably advanced militaries and sizable militaries. So, in that sense, the US currently has an advantage over China. But what if the US goes into a civil war and then what happens? Well, obviously, I wouldn't be surprised if the rebels in the U.S. had been a little bit more successful. Um, I wouldn't have been surprised if you would start getting foreigners trying to start funding the rebels. Perhaps people from Russia, because Russia has a large number of spies in the U.S. So it wouldn't be hard for Russia to perhaps launder some money into the country, or obviously military supplies would be a lot more difficult, so that wouldn't happen. But the rebels in the US will fail. Why? Because they don't have military support. So what do I mean by that? Well, Russian Revolution had military support. French Revolution had military support. You've got the military support from the French Revolution. Um, Germany, in their revolution, the extreme elements didn't have military support, and the moderate elements moderatized in order to get military support. So that's an interesting story there. So anyway, that's the situation here. Now, Hong Kong, okay? Now, I've been very vocal saying that the 5 demands that Hong Kong has are irrational, that any reasonable country would refuse those 5 demands. The idea that that Hong Kong should not have extradition treaties with the other Chinese countries is absurd. Okay, from a political standpoint, because the extradition treaty was not just with the People's Republic of China, it was also with Macau and with Taiwan, the Republic of China. So it wasn't just something that was for the People's Republic of China. And furthermore, a lot of people need to understand that in extradition, the country doing the extraditing can refuse. In other words, or the country upon whom the extradition request is sent can refuse. In other words, if someone commits a crime in mainland China and then flees to Hong Kong, then Hong Kong can actually refuse the extradition if they want to. The Hong Kong government can. So it's not as if it gives mainland China any additional powers. But what this means, however, is that, let's say, a communist revolutionary goes into Hong Kong, commits a crime, and can flee to mainland China, but there's no extradition treaty, and therefore there's not even a token question of could you please send this guy in to stand trial, or the other way around. Let's say a pro-democracy revolutionary and terrorist goes into the People's Republic of China and commits a terrorist act. Now, terrorist is actually a very vague thing. Let's say a criminal act, an act of rebellion, an act of subversion, and or sabotage, and then comes back to Hong Kong. Now, the People's Republic of China can't actually apprehend a criminal. But of course, the US has doubled down on its support for this idea, this absolutely absurd idea that there shouldn't be an extradition support. When Marco Rubio was in favor of granting visas to people from Hong Kong, even if they were under suspicion of having committed violent acts. So you could have literal terrorists from Hong Kong escape to the US. Let's say someone manufactures Molotov cocktails in Hong Kong, which they have done, okay? So the people say the protests are peaceful, but I'm going to say not all the protests in Hong Kong were very peaceful. So there are situations in which the police in Hong Kong was very justified in tearing down the protesters, especially if the protesters start occupying buildings and preventing the function of those buildings, then that becomes very criminal and the police needs to do something. Otherwise, their authority is dissolved. So there you go. And of course, the Hong Kong protesters were asking for third party oversight, in other words, NGO oversight on the Hong Kong police brutality question. Now, obviously, it shouldn't be a surprise that a lot of the more outspoken individuals in all this had ties with the Open Society Foundation. Big surprise there. George Soros. Hong Kong protests are a US op. Actually proven. I've done this in a previous video. So, well, not a purely US op. So there's obviously people locally that have an interest in the protest. But the US has been supporting the protests in a way, as a way to destabilize China. And I think this is dishonorable. If the US doesn't like China, the US should go to war and conquer China. Or at least put a few military bases, give the lion's share to the Republic of China from Taiwan. They can go back to the mainland. It'll be a happy ceremony for everyone involved. The US gets a few military bases. The outlying autonomous regions gain independence. And however, have a supranational organization with the other former Chinese countries, so that the U.S. and Russia can't get too greedy when looking at China. So, and of course, the U.S. might have to do some foreign policy concessions in the Middle East in order to balance the power with Russia, because Russia obviously would not like it if the US took over parts of China. So, in other words, there are ways for this to play out in a much more honorable way. Unfortunately, the US government has for a long time shown that it is unwilling to act honorably. The US has had a lot of espionage on allies. And now the question of espionage is a very complex question, because obviously in times of war, misdirection is useful. And I don't have objections to secrecy, but I am on a moral level opposed to the idea of people lying. Okay? I'm having connection issues for upload rate has dropped. Okay, but anyway, I'm on a moral sense opposed to the idea of people lying, which means I'm much more opposed to the idea of the government telling people to lie. So I would say that espionage should really only apply to countries that you are at war with, because then you have you actually have a mutual understanding between countries that are at war that they should not reveal their full hands to each other. Okay? So there's an understanding that the other side cannot be trusted. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to this, such as the idea of truces. You shouldn't be breaking truces. You shouldn't be having false surrenders and other things like that. I understand that there are exceptions to that, but my point is, I don't want the government to be telling people to lie in times of peace. Okay? So, anyway, I don't want to morally grandstand on that issue for too much. But anyway, going back to Hong Kong, it is absolutely realistic, the result that has happened. The fact that the Chinese Communist Party has now sent their forces into Hong Kong in order to restore order. How could the protesters not have foreseen this? Okay? The People's Republic of China has very logical and very realistic reasons to not want to lose Hong Kong. Hong Kong is next to Shenzhen. Okay, a major stock exchange and shipping center. It's next to a largely urbanized area. And if Hong Kong goes independent, what is Hong Kong going to do? Well, Hong Kong would be a small country, so they're obviously not going to have a large enough military to defend against China. So what are they going to do? Well, what they're going to do is they're going to ask another country, they're going to lease a military base to another country in order to organize the defense of Hong Kong. And what does this mean? Well, this means that either the US or the UK, as those are the most likely candidates in this situation, would have a military base just next to Hong Kong, next to one of the most urbanized and industrialized regions of China, and most populated regions of China. Now, let's take a look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. And let's say instead of the Cuban Missile Crisis happening in Cuba, let's say Staten Island in New York City went independent, okay? And in order to secure themselves, they offered a military base to Russia. Or actually, let's say this happened during the Cold War. So to the Soviet Union. So now the Soviet Union is sending missiles to Staten Island, basing missiles in Staten Island next to one of the US's major stock exchanges and shipping centers, and in one of the most urbanized and populated regions of the country. So that's the Cuban Missile Crisis times 1,000. So now, can you see why China has a legitimate reason not to want to lose Hong Kong? So this is a comparison I'm making. China losing Hong Kong, and then Hong Kong necessarily, okay, because Hong Kong can't defend itself, it's too small, necessarily giving a military base to the UK or to the US would be the same as the US in the Cold War losing Staten Island and then having the Soviet Union build missile silos on Staten Island, which would be a complete outrage and a chaos. That would be immediate war. So the People's Republic of China is more likely to go to war than to give up Hong Kong. They're more likely to go into a total war than to lose Hong Kong. That's how important Hong Kong is strategically to the People's Republic of China. So for that reason, it makes a lot of sense that China is not going to let the protesters in Hong Kong win. Because what is the ultimate goal of the protesters? Because if you're protesting against the extradition for fear that and I would add unreasonably, for fear that the People's Republic of China is going to use that to slowly take over, which they have a right to eventually anyway. So let's be honest here. Hong Kong, by treaty, will eventually be fully integrated into the People's Republic of China. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So knowing that, and that the protesters are explicitly opposed to this, then it makes sense to understand that the protesters in Hong Kong, the violent ones among them, are interested in rebellion against the People's Republic of China, which, as I said before, from a realistic perspective, needs to be suppressed. So, from the perspective of the People's Republic of China, the People's Republic of China is making complete common sense in taking over the security of Hong Kong when the police of Hong Kong has been not as successful as they could be in putting down the riots. So, going back onto that issue, that it is common sense what the People's Republic of China is doing, it is also added to that it is known that the U.S. is supporting the protesters, if not materially, informationally. So in the grand strategy between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China, the People's Republic of China losing Hong Kong is to a huge advantage of the United States and NATO. So in that sense, it makes complete sense what the People's Republic of China is doing. Now, let me be very clear here. I'm not a supporter of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not a supporter of the oppression that the People's Republic of China puts on its own people. I'm not a supporter of any of that. But what I am a supporter for is reasonable actions based off of realistic concerns, which the People's Republic of China in Hong Kong is doing, and which I say was done at the Tiananmen Square protests. And I think the most shameful part about the protests is the fact that China is not willing to own up to them, because I think they have every right to own up to them. So there you go. So tell me what you think. I think I'm running low on mucus in the back of my nasal cavity as while I'm speaking. My saliva seems to be drying up. So my airways are being used. So I think I've somewhat exhausted my speaking capability. But anyway, thank you all for watching. Tell me what you think. Do you think that the charges against the other police officers involved in the George Floyd affair are excessive, or do you think that they are justified? How do you think the court will react to the exact charges that are currently being put out? Do you think that the government has been too soft on the rioters, or do you think that the country should be overthrown, despite previous historical events showing that such an eventuality could be disastrous, not only to the US, but to the world as a whole? What do you think? Tell me what you think. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on Anavultus over and